I never thought my own family would seat me beside the kitchen sink on Christmas Eve. Snow drifted softly across the front windows as I carried 2 homemade pecan pies through the doorway of my son's house, with cold air still clinging to my coat. The place looked beautiful in the way expensive homes always do during the holidays. Garland wrapped around the staircase. Crystal ornaments shimmered beneath warm, golden lights. Somewhere deeper inside the house, Frank Sinatra played quietly, while guests laughed over glasses of red wine. "Mom, you made it," Ethan said distractedly after opening the door, already glancing back toward the dining room behind him. He kissed my cheek quickly before taking the pies from my hands. Vanessa appeared seconds later in a cream-colored cashmere dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. "Margaret, you look freezing," she said with a polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. "We had to rearrange seating because more people showed up than expected." I nodded lightly. "That happens at Christmas." For a moment, I thought nothing of it until I followed her toward the dining room and realized every chair around the long decorated table already had a handwritten name card, except mine. Vanessa touched my arm gently and pointed toward the kitchen behind us, where a small folding table sat beside the sink, near stacks of casserole dishes. "We figured this would be quieter and more comfortable for you," she said softly. One of her country club friends glanced away awkwardly, while another pretended not to notice. Ethan adjusted silverware at the main table without looking up once. I set my purse carefully onto the folding chair and noticed something strange resting near the kitchen counter beside the Christmas cards. An old brass key attached to a faded red ribbon I had not seen in nearly 20 years. Why was that key here tonight of all nights? The folding chair wobbled slightly every time someone opened the refrigerator beside me. I smoothed my napkin across my lap and listened to the sounds drifting in from the dining room beyond the kitchen doorway. Crystal glasses clinked together. Someone laughed loudly about ski season in Aspen. The smell of rosemary turkey and cinnamon candles filled the house so heavily it almost made me dizzy for a moment. Vanessa moved gracefully between guests carrying trays while introducing people to one another, like she was hosting a magazine photo shoot instead of Christmas dinner. "This renovation changed everything," I heard one woman say from the dining room. "The house feels completely different now." Vanessa smiled proudly. "We practically rebuilt half of it after Richard passed." I lowered my eyes toward my coffee cup without correcting her. Ethan stepped into the kitchen, briefly carrying another bottle of wine. "You okay back here?" he asked quietly, without fully meeting my eyes. "I am fine," I answered. He nodded too quickly. "It is just crowded tonight." Before I could respond, Vanessa called his name from the dining room, and he disappeared again almost immediately. Near the sink, I noticed the old brass key, once more resting beside a stack of unopened Christmas cards. The faded ribbon attached to it looked frayed now, but I still remembered tying that ribbon myself during another Christmas decades earlier, when Richard and I had barely enough money to buy gifts for Ethan. A younger guest wandered into the kitchen, searching for ice, and stopped when she saw me sitting there alone. "Wait," she said carefully. "Are you Ethan's mother?" I smiled politely. "That depends who is asking." She laughed softly, then lowered her voice. "My husband said this property used to belong to one of the original Dawson development partners. Is that true?" Before I could answer, Vanessa suddenly appeared in the doorway, holding a serving tray a little too tightly. "Claire," she interrupted quickly, "the prime rib is ready." Then her eyes flicked briefly toward the brass key beside the counter, and for the first time that night, I saw something unexpected behind her smile. Nervousness. Snow pressed harder against the windows as dinner finally began. From the kitchen table I could see only part of the dining room through the doorway, but I recognized nearly every voice drifting toward me between bites of turkey and forced laughter. Vanessa loved surrounding herself with people who sounded impressed by her life. Country club couples, real estate investors. One local news anchor I vaguely remembered from television. "This house is incredible," a man said loudly. "You two really built something special?" Vanessa laughed softly. "Well, Ethan handles the business side. I just try to keep everything running smoothly." I noticed Ethan glance toward the kitchen for half a second before lowering his wine glass again. He looked tired tonight in a way I had not seen before. The younger woman from earlier wandered back into the kitchen carrying an empty serving tray. "Can I sit for a second?" she asked quietly. "Of course." She lowered herself into the folding chair across from me. "Honestly, this party is beautiful, but everybody feels so tense," I smiled faintly. "Holiday traditions have a way of doing that." Before she could answer, voices rose briefly from the dining room. Someone had apparently asked about the original Dawson Development Company, because I heard Vanessa respond too quickly. Oh, that was years before Ethan took over anything. Then came another voice, older, deeper, unfamiliar. Actually, the Dawson name carried a lot of weight in Chicago real estate back then. Silence followed for a moment. Even from the kitchen, I felt the shift in the room. The younger woman across from me looked curious now. "Were you involved with the company?" she asked carefully. I reached for my water glass, but paused when I noticed the old brass key was gone from the counter beside the Christmas cards. A strange feeling settled into my chest. At that exact moment, the front doorbell rang loudly through the house, and Ethan stood so fast, his chair scraped sharply against the hardwood floor. "That cannot be him already," Vanessa whispered.
The entire house seemed to pause after the doorbell rang. Conversations faded. Even the Christmas music felt strangely distant beneath the sound of wind pushing snow against the windows. Vanessa set down her wine glass too carefully before smoothing both hands along the front of her dress. "Probably another guest stuck in the storm," she said quickly, although nobody had asked. Ethan walked toward the front hallway while several people at the dining table exchanged curious looks. From the kitchen I could only see part of the entryway reflected faintly in the dark dining room windows, but I recognized the voice almost immediately. "Roads are terrible tonight," the man said while stamping snow from his boots. "Sorry I am late." My chest tightened slightly. Arthur Bennett had not changed much over the years except for the silver hair now visible beneath the snowflakes melting across his coat collar. Ethan shook his hand firmly. "Arthur, good to see you." Vanessa appeared beside them almost instantly. "We thought you canceled." Arthur laughed softly. "Not after driving all the way from Lake Geneva for Christmas dinner." As he stepped farther inside the house, his eyes moved slowly across the room, greeting familiar faces until suddenly they stopped on me sitting alone beside the kitchen sink. His expression changed immediately. "Margaret Dawson," he said with genuine surprise. Several heads turned at once. I stood carefully from the folding chair. "Hello, Arthur." Before Vanessa could redirect the moment, Arthur crossed the room toward me, smiling warmly. "My God, it has been years." He glanced around the kitchen with visible confusion before lowering his voice slightly. "Why are you sitting back here?" Vanessa answered before I could speak. Oh, Margaret likes quieter spaces. Arthur looked unconvinced but said nothing for a moment. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the old brass key now hanging from Ethan's hand near the dining room entrance. The color slowly left Arthur's face. "Wait," he said quietly. "You still have Richard's harbor key?" The room fell completely silent as Ethan looked down at the key in his hand like he had never truly seen it before. Nobody spoke for several seconds after Arthur mentioned the harbor key. Snow continued swirling outside the tall windows while the Christmas lights reflected softly across dozens of stunned faces around the dining room. Ethan looked confused as he turned the old brass key over in his hand. "Dad kept this in his office safe," he said slowly. "I found it last month during renovations." Arthur stared at the key carefully before looking back at me. "Richard never told him?" he asked quietly. My silence answered the question before words ever could. Vanessa stepped forward immediately, trying to regain control of the room. "I think everybody is getting carried away over an old key." Arthur let out a short breath, almost like disbelief. "That key is not sentimental decoration," he said. "It opens Harbor House." Several guests exchanged uncertain looks while Ethan frowned. "The lake property?" Arthur nodded once. "The original Dawson property on Lake Michigan. The one tied to the development trust." Ethan blinked hard. "Dad sold that years ago." Arthur looked directly at him now. "No. Richard transferred controlling ownership before he died." The room became so quiet I could hear ice shifting inside someone's untouched whiskey glass. Vanessa forced a nervous smile. "Transferred it to who?" Arthur hesitated briefly before answering. "Margaret." Across the dining room, Ethan's face drained of color completely. "What?" Arthur slowly removed a folder from his leather briefcase, still damp from melted snow. "Your father structured the entire Holiday Property Trust around your mother after the recession nearly destroyed the company 20 years ago. Margaret kept the business alive by mortgaging her own inheritance without telling anyone." Vanessa stared at me like she no longer recognized the woman sitting beside the kitchen sink. Arthur's voice softened slightly. "Legally speaking, Margaret still controls the Harbor Trust holdings connected to this house renovation project." Ethan looked down at the brass key again with shaking hands while I quietly folded my napkin beside the empty pie plates. Then Vanessa asked the question nobody else in the room seemed brave enough to say out loud. "Are you telling me this house technically belongs to her?" Vanessa looked toward Ethan, immediately waiting for him to deny everything Arthur had just said. But Ethan remained frozen near the dining room entrance, still holding the brass key in one hand while snow melted slowly from Arthur Bennett's coat onto the hardwood floor beneath him. "There has to be some misunderstanding," Vanessa said carefully, although her voice no longer carried the smooth confidence from earlier that evening. Arthur opened the folder quietly and removed several aging documents held together with worn paper clips. "Your husband's father created a layered trust after 1998, he explained. Most of the family properties were protected under Margaret's controlling authority because the banks would not refinance the company without additional collateral." Ethan shook his head slowly. "Dad never talked about any of this." I finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. Your father hated discussing debt. The room remained painfully still around us. A few guests avoided eye contact completely now, while others stared openly toward the kitchen like they were suddenly seeing me differently for the first time all night. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. So what exactly does controlling authority mean? Arthur hesitated only briefly. It means major renovation financing, sale approvals, and trust restructuring still require Margaret's signature. Vanessa blinked hard. Wait. Her eyes moved slowly around the dining room toward the staircase, the chandeliers, the newly renovated walls. You mean everything we spent this year? Arthur nodded once. Was technically approved under temporary review pending Margaret's final authorization. Ethan finally looked directly at me now, and guilt spread visibly across his face. Mom, he said quietly, did you know about this the whole time? I held his gaze for a long moment before answering honestly. I knew your father wanted the family protected after he was gone. Vanessa laughed softly under her breath, but there was no humor left in it anymore. Protected from what? Arthur carefully closed the folder and looked toward her. Richard Dawson believed money could make people forget who actually built the table they were sitting at. Then Ethan slowly lowered himself into the empty chair beside the kitchen sink while guests watched silently, because for the first time all evening nobody seemed sure who truly belonged at the head of the house anymore. The guests slowly drifted back toward the dining room after Arthur closed the folder, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody laughed as loudly anymore. Forks scraped quietly against plates while Christmas music played almost awkwardly in the background now. Ethan remained seated beside me at the small kitchen table, staring down at the brass key resting near his hand. Vanessa stood across the room, pouring herself another glass of wine she clearly did not want. So all these years, she finally said without looking directly at me, you just sat back and let everyone think Ethan built everything himself. Her tone stayed calm but sharp around the edges. I folded my hands together carefully. Your father worked hard for this family. Vanessa let out a quiet breath. That is not what I asked. Ethan rubbed his forehead slowly. Vanessa, no, she interrupted softly. I want to understand something. She finally turned toward me fully now. Were you ever planning to tell us? Snowlight reflected faintly across the dining room windows behind her, making the whole house feel colder somehow despite the glowing fireplace nearby. I answered honestly because there no longer seemed much point avoiding the truth. Your father believed people behave differently when money enters the room. Vanessa laughed once under her breath. That sounds convenient. Arthur remained near the fireplace watching silently while several guests pretended not to listen even though everyone clearly was. Ethan looked exhausted now. Mom, why did Dad trust only you with all this? I glanced toward the dining room table where Vanessa's expensive holiday centerpiece sat surrounded by crystal glasses and untouched dessert plates. Because your father remembered what happened before any of this existed, I said quietly. When the banks froze our accounts, I sold my mother's jewelry and refinanced my inheritance to keep the company alive. Vanessa crossed her arms tighter. And now what? You are going to hold that over everyone tonight? For the first time all evening a faint disappointment crossed my face. No, Vanessa, I said softly. But I did expect not to be seated beside dirty dishes on Christmas Eve. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. Then Ethan slowly stood up from the kitchen table and looked toward the empty chair at the head of the dining room. No one touched dessert after that. The pecan pies sat untouched near the kitchen counter while guests slowly gathered coats and offered awkward holiday goodbyes that sounded thinner than before. A few people quietly thanked me on their way out. Others avoided looking directly at Vanessa altogether. The house that had felt loud and polished earlier now carried the heavy stillness that comes after something irreversible has finally been spoken aloud. Ethan stood near the front window watching taillights disappear through the falling snow. "I should have known something was wrong," he said quietly without turning around. Dad never let anyone move a single dollar without triple-checking paperwork. Arthur buttoned his coat slowly near the door. "Your father trusted your mother because she never confused ownership with attention." Vanessa remained at the dining table staring at the untouched centerpiece she had spent all afternoon arranging. One candle had burned almost completely down beside her wine glass, leaving melted wax across the linen runner. "So everybody thinks I am some selfish villain now," she muttered softly. I shook my head gently. "No, Vanessa. People saw a family forget itself for a while." She looked up sharply at that, but her expression softened almost immediately into something closer to exhaustion than anger. Ethan finally turned toward us. "Mom, why did you never say anything after Dad died?" The question lingered between us while wind rattled lightly against the windows upstairs. I glanced toward the old family photographs lining the hallway wall. Richard smiling beside construction crews. Ethan holding blueprints in his 20s. Christmas mornings long before this house became expensive enough to intimidate people. "Because I thought eventually love would matter more than ownership," I answered honestly. Vanessa lowered her eyes after that. For the first time all evening she looked less like a polished hostess and more like someone suddenly realizing how fragile status could become overnight. Arthur handed Ethan the folder quietly. "There is one more thing your father wanted reviewed after Christmas," he said carefully. Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Arthur hesitated before answering. "The trust includes a succession condition nobody opened after Richard passed away." The house felt strangely peaceful after midnight. Snow covered the backyard in a smooth white layer while soft Christmas lights still glowed around the windows and staircase downstairs. Most of the dishes had finally been cleared away. Vanessa sat quietly near the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket now with none of the polished confidence she carried earlier that evening. Ethan remained at the dining room table reading through the final pages Arthur had left behind before driving back through the storm. I stood alone in the kitchen making fresh coffee when I heard Ethan's chair scrape softly against the hardwood floor. "Mom," he said carefully. "Dad left a letter inside the trust documents." I turned slowly toward him. His eyes looked red with exhaustion and something deeper than guilt now. "Regret, maybe." He held the folded paper gently like he was afraid it might fall apart in his hands. He wrote that the family would only keep the harbor properties if everyone inside the house treated each other with dignity. Vanessa looked up immediately from the fireplace. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. If the trust administrator believed the family environment became harmful or exploitative, the ownership authority stayed permanently under your control. Silence settled across the room again, but this time it felt different, softer, somehow less sharp around the edges. Vanessa stared toward the Christmas tree for several seconds before finally speaking. I really thought respect came from building the perfect life, she admitted quietly. I did not realize how easy it is to lose yourself trying to impress people. I walked slowly toward the dining table where the folding chair still sat beside the kitchen sink, untouched from earlier. Then Ethan quietly carried it away and placed it back in the storage closet downstairs without saying a word. A few minutes later, the three of us sat together at the main dining table eating reheated pie while snow continued falling outside the windows. Nobody talked much after that. We did not need to. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt divided into important rooms and forgotten ones.